Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone joining us today. My name is Jessica Taylor, and I'm here at the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation in Ottawa, Canada. On behalf of CEE, I'd like to wish you all a happy, safe, and healthy new year and welcome you to the first installment of 2021 for our Environmental Evidence Summit webinar series. Today's especially timely session, Evidence Syntheses in EcoHealth and Exploring Interactions Between the Environment and Human Health and Wellbeing, will be chaired by Jackie Eels. So to get things started, I will hand it over to you, Jackie.
Thanks very much, Jess, and a very warm welcome to everyone for joining this webinar. So warm welcome, and this webinar is going to be a collation of the recent prominent secondary research under the theme of eco-health. So this emerging field of eco-health really investigates how changes in the Earth's ecosystems affect human health and well-being, and indeed vice versa, as the activities and health treatments we as humans undertake, receive and implement have an impact on the environment. So in recent years, there's been a growing appreciation of the importance of this environment-health nexus. And alongside this recognition comes a need for research to assess the potential and realised trade-offs between the environmental stewardship and also human livelihoods, and also how anthropogenic changes to the environment have impacts on human health and well-being. Following the increase in primary research in this topic area, syntheses of this growing field of research are now also required to ensure that future policy decisions will be made using the best available evidence. The environment health nexus is particularly pertinent given the current degrading state of the environment and as impacts on climate change take hold. So in summary, we are delighted to present this session, which includes prominent speakers from a range of background disciplines, which actually showcases this very interdisciplinary nature of the topic. So we're going to hear from researchers focused on environmental contaminants, the climate health nexus, conservation and human health in the global south, antibiotic resistance in the environment, the effects of sounds from nature on human well-being, and the connections between people and place. So really diverse set of speakers we have today. And diving straight into this, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Cheryl Cowdery is the section head of the Targeted Epidemiology and Biomonitoring section at Health Canada. Cheryl leads a team that studies human exposures to environmental chemicals, as well as the health effects associated with these exposures. She has close to 20 years of experience in chemicals risk assessment, air quality and environmental biomonitoring. She also serves as co-chair of the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Programme's Human Health Assessment Group. So that's Cheryl's introduction. So I'll just hand over.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jackie, and it's great to be here and to be able to give this presentation. So I'm talking today on behalf of the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Programme's Human Health Assessment Group, which I am the Canadian co-chair for. Our group puts together probably every 5 years an assessment, and in 2021 a new assessment will be released. So talking today about how we synthesize this information to put it together for decision and policy makers. Okay, so why are we worried about health and contaminants in the Arctic? The Arctic is a global sink for many contaminants, and so Arctic populations are exposed to chemicals that are not produced and oftentimes not even used in their environment, and yet they're exposed to significantly higher levels than other parts of the world, often because they're consuming diets that are high in marine mammals, and also because of the bioaccumulation of persistent organic pollutants and metals in Arctic food chains. And there's lots of work being done internationally to manage chemicals such as the Stockholm Convention or the Minamata Convention, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And so the AMAP Human Health Assessment Group, every approximately, like I said, 5 years, will do an assessment to give a state of knowledge and recommendations for future research. So this is where AMAP sits. It's one of 6 working groups established under the Arctic Council, and its primary focus is a little bit different than the other 5 working groups, but they all work together under Arctic Council. AMAP is tasked with monitoring levels of contaminants in the environment, as well as assessing the effects of those contaminants. So not only is there a human health assessment group, but there are working groups on POPs, on Mercury, and assessments are published on a variety of different topics. And AMAP is looking to document levels and trends, the effects of these contaminants, and also to produce sound, science-based, policy relevant assessments and public outreach. So this is where the synthesis comes into play. How do we synthesize the evidence to make this relevant for policy and decision makers? I wanted to share this quote because I think this is really important to the work, especially of the Human Health Assessment Group, that this isn't just about identifying contaminants that might cause health effects and then creating regulations or coming down with strict advice on how we could eliminate those contaminants from the diet, because the diet is also a culturally and spiritually and nutritionally important part of many Arctic populations. So this quote is, "Our traditional foods are much more than calories or nutrients. They are a lifeline throughout our culture and reflect the health of entire ecosystem." So this is from Inuit Circumpolar Council Alaska in 2015. So when we are doing these assessments, really what we're looking at is how do we characterize the risk benefits of consuming traditional country and local foods that may be significant sources of environmental contaminants. To give you a little bit of background on the assessments that I'd been talking about, so since 1998, we've published 4 and soon to be 5 human health assessments, and those are the pictures at the top that are probably hard to see. But I wanted to note that below are only a sample of the many other assessments that are published under the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. So there's a lot of collaboration from the health assessments that I've put at the top of this figure and the assessments from other groups at the bottom of the figure, and there's a back and forth there on how we inform each other and how our work informs the decisions and the conclusions of these different assessments. So I wanted to talk a little bit in this context about evidence synthesis on the bit of a puzzle. What are some of the issues that we encounter when trying to synthesize evidence? So we have contaminants in the environment and we have human health, and how do they interact, and how do we best study the levels in country foods, traditional foods, and health effects in humans, and how do we make sure that we get a picture that's coherent that we can present as a circumpolar Arctic working group. So the first issue I wanted to talk about was geography. So on the right-hand side, you see a figure from our last assessment in 2015. And the different circles indicate, different colors indicate different times. So the lighter circle is an earlier time point and the darker circle is more recent. And the bigger the circle, the higher the level of contaminants. So you can see that geographically, we have differences. The size of the circle in Greenland and Northern Canada is a lot bigger than the size of the circles that you see in Scandinavia. And then you also see that while we have some circles and on some parts of the map, there's also large parts of the map where we don't have a lot of data. So this is one of the issues, is how do we present an overall picture when we have disparate data from different regions? It has been shown that levels of some contaminants are declining, but there's differences, and you can see this by the change in the size of the circle, right? So the more of a light colored circle that you can see behind a dark circle, the bigger the change there's been over time. So that's one difference. We've also been noticing that there's been a transition to a more Westernized diet, and this has positive and negative effects. And this doesn't mean that this transition is voluntary. It may happen because there isn't other food, or because it's difficult to go hunting, or because of climate change. We have seen positive effects, including reduction in contaminant levels in pregnant women who are particularly vulnerable to some contaminants. But there are also negative effects that include increasing obesity, metabolic disorders, dental problems, as well as lower levels of nutrients such as vitamin D and iodine. And of course, and I'll highlight this, but it's a topic all unto itself, high food insecurity in the Arctic among many populations. And so because we have all these differences geographically, and I think we can present them quite nicely, say in a figure on the right, but they're different populations require different risk communication, different risk assessment techniques, and different risk management, obviously depending where you are living in the Arctic and what you are being exposed to. The second synthesis issue that I wanted to highlight was laboratory methods. So in order to have confidence that we're comparing data that are equal and not comparing apples to oranges, AMAP worked very hard, and I think it's definitely a success of AMAP, to develop a ring test or a quality assessment, quality control methods and program, so that any time that data is reported in one of our assessments, we know that it's been through some kind of national program, and that all countries and all researchers report on what laboratory is doing their analyses and what quality assessment, quality control scheme they're doing. So I think this is one of the most important things when synthesizing the data that we have, that we know that we're comparing mercury levels in the Faroes are comparable to the mercury levels that are being reported in Northern Canada or in Norway or in Finland. And so this is definitely one area where the AMAP human health assessments have a level of confidence in the data being reported and the ability to synthesize and compare that data. The third synthesis issue that I wanted to discuss was temporal trends. And I think this is really important, especially from a policy or decision-making perspective, that we'd like to know, are levels of contaminants going down or are they going up? And we can only do this if the data that we're comparing, if we're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. I apologize, there's a grade 2 math class going on behind me if you can hear that. So on the right-hand side, I've presented a figure again from our last assessment in 2015. And it might be hard to read, but you'll see that the areas in yellow have area-wide community studies. The red circles are where we have blood monitoring data. The green areas are where we have cohort studies. And the areas where you see black circles, are where we have temporal trend data. So we don't have temporal trend data in all parts of the Arctic, but we do have some, and this data is really important. And when we're looking at temporal trend data, we have to look at what population is being looked at. What are the different time points? So we're comparing trends in say the Eastern Arctic versus the Western Arctic. Are we comparing the same time points? And obviously also what contaminants are we looking for? I think temporal trends can rely heavily on cohort studies, and this really highlights the need and the importance of cohort studies because we're following the same population over time, and we can report levels of contaminants in those same people. I wanted to highlight one project, the Mercury North project, which was developed to establish baseline mercury levels in Arctic populations for the purpose of assessing long-term trends and evaluating the minimata convention on mercury. So this should be published relatively soon. It was in press just late last year. And this kind of work that brought together data from all or almost all circumpolar countries and was analyzed in one lab in Quebec. And those results helped to set a baseline that we can compare to in the future. And this is the kind of work that AMAP is trying to do when synthesizing information in our assessment, is how can we collaboratively come together to produce a report that gives a complete, or as complete as we can, circumpolar picture about contaminants in Arctic populations. Obviously, we can do better, and I think every AMAP assessment does a little bit more, and that's how science works. So we can improve the synthesis that we do by doing more multidisciplinary work. And I wanted to highlight the ArcRISK project, which was established to look at linkages between contaminants, climate change, and human health. And many members of the AMAP Human Health Assessment Group were part of that project. We work well with other AMAP experts on either persistent organic pollutants or mercury, And working with multidisciplinary approaches such as the One Health approach helps to link health and contaminants to zoonoses, the environment, wildlife, and other areas of research that are definitely linked to what we're looking at. Partnerships improve the synthesis, so the AMAP Human Health Group has been successful in part because it's longstanding group of individuals who have been there for a long time and have built relationships over time, and that have partnerships with academia, with communities, with Indigenous organizations. And the stronger these relationships are, the better the synthesis is from all types of different information. Including Indigenous perspectives in our assessments is incredibly important, and the assessment coming out in 2021 includes the component on dietary transition, and it includes some Indigenous perspective on how diets are changing and why that is, and how traditional country and local foods can be promoted while also balancing the risk from contaminants that may be found in those foods. And finally, monitoring programs need to adapt. Obviously, if we're going to be relevant, we need to continue to look at chemicals of concern as chemicals that we know about, and also emerging chemicals of concern to the Arctic. We need to continue to have coordinated biomonitoring and human health effects research. So in conclusion, it's important to bring this information together for policy and decision makers. There are new ways of synthesizing information, and we can always learn from others, and I'm happy to be here to hear what other people are doing. Collaboration is essential to the work that we do, and incremental improvements move science in the right direction, and I think each assessment comes out with a new perspective and slowly works towards establishing even stronger international chemicals risk management. So in the end, all of these efforts ensure that AMAP human health assessments provide scientific-based evidence for decision makers and policymakers to address chemicals risk management, which for us at its essence must answer the question, is my food safe to eat? I'd just like to acknowledge all of the lead authors and members of the Human Health Assessment Group that I work very closely with, and thank them for all of the work they've done. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks so much for that presentation there, Cheryl. I must say that I forgot to mention to everybody that please do, of course, ask any questions for our panelists. Any questions that we don't have time to cover during the course of this webinar, we will be able to answer them to you directly. So please do ask your questions, and if we can't get through them, we will answer them directly. I'd just actually quite like to ask Cheryl a quick question from myself, and that's about the Indigenous Perspectives work. Would you hope to include qualitative researchers in future assessments, or is that something that you already have capability within the team and are already sort of implementing at the moment?
Thanks, Jackie. I think that's a great question. I think we're always looking to how we can include other ways of knowing or other fields of science. So I'm not sure that we have a lot of qualitative assessment, I think tangentially, but I think that would be something that would be interesting in the future. And right now we're working closely with the Inuit Circumpolar Council of Canada, but there's obviously more work to be done to try and include more Indigenous perspectives. So that's a great idea.
Yeah, absolutely, very important. Thanks very much, Cheryl. And I'm going to move swiftly on to introduce our next speaker. Denise Thompson is a PhD student at the University of Alberta in Canada, and she is studying the development of evidence synthesis methods to assess the health impacts of climate change. She's worked in health promotion and health research for about 20 years, and she is currently leading a climate health working group within the Cochrane collaboration. Denise is actually speaking twice today, so I'll be welcoming her back shortly. But for now, we're going to move to her first presentation. So over to you, Denise.
Okay, and hello everyone. Good morning from Alberta, Canada, where I am. So my presentation, this first presentation is called Scoping Reviews on Climate Health Topics. And this presentation actually, because as you know, this was originally submitted for the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence conference that was scheduled to take place in June last year. So I wrote this abstract probably over a year ago now. So I'll be doing this presentation in two parts, reflective of the length of time that that has gone on in my thinking, and how this has moved from what I thought was going to be a quick side project into being the focus of my PhD. Sorry, let me just figure out how to advance the screen because that would be useful. Okay, so I have no conflict of interest to declare. So as I mentioned, this is in two parts. One, to talk very briefly about the challenges in conducting scoping reviews on topics in climate change and health. And part two, to talk a bit about what I'm moving on to in terms of methods development. Okay, so just a little bit of an overview of some of the themes that will be coming out, just to kind of give you a bit of a spoiler alert. So climate change is already a creator of significant health impacts. Everything from heat, we think of climate change as being warming and an intensification of heat waves, which bring obvious health impacts, and then more diffuse, maybe more distal health impacts, such as impacts, for example, intensifying drought can have impacts on nutritional availability. And this broad range of impacts are projected to increase as climate change intensifies, as it will. Also, we know that the health impacts from climate change and extreme weather events are mediated by a lot of other vulnerabilities, and this makes it complex to sort out what is climate change and what is other things. There's also an evolving science called detection and attribution, and as the methods for this become more developed, this helps us figure out the extent to which climate change is related to any given health impact. So evidence synthesis in health, I know I don't have to spend a lot of time on this for this audience. I'm talking in this presentation mainly about scoping reviews, but of course that's just one form of evidence synthesis. I've listed a few there that are often used in health research. What these different forms of synthesis have in common is typically, although they're produced by differing teams with a range of purposes, they're usually done with an eye to influencing either further research or policy making, the health decisions. The point is they're produced for a purpose, like trying to influence what people do in the future. And there's always a trade-off between the methodological rigor and the time to complete them. Again, I probably don't need to spend a lot of time on explaining what I mean by methods, but what I'm talking about here is the tools used as you produce any given evidence synthesis, such as a scoping review, to guide the collection, selection, analysis, and presentation of data. And at its best, you define those methods in advance. Methods research allows us to make well-informed decisions about most appropriate methods, to really think through how you're conducting an evidence synthesis, to understand trade-offs in terms of bias, efficiency, usability, resource use, the trade-off I mentioned earlier between rigor and time to complete. So why is this important? How did I wind up thinking about all this? So my PhD program is in the Department of Pediatrics in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta. And when I started my program, I thought I would do a scoping review of the impacts of climate change on child health. So I worked with a very experienced, skilled information specialist who did a search for me. It brought back a lot of results, which I intrepidly dove into, thinking, okay, well, I knew this was going to be big, but no problem, I'm tough. And it really quickly became really hard because I had naively not properly thought through what I meant by the impacts of climate change on child health. And so I very quickly got bogged down into what is climate change? What is weather? What is, if I'm looking at a study saying, oh, malaria went up in this region of the world and it was linked to, there was a lot of rain that year. Well, that's maybe climate change, maybe it's not, you know, like some years you just get more rain than others. That's the way it's always been. So it quickly became very complex. And so that's what I mean in my third bullet point in when I say in this context, what is climate change? And that question influences the development of your search strategy, which I'll talk a bit about in my second presentation, and huge challenges around inclusion and exclusion criteria that I was not at that point equipped to deal with. So I decided to look for guidance. I figured other people must have approached these questions. So I did a scoping review of scoping reviews, where I looked for health studies with a research question explicitly including climate change or extreme weather events, or a concept that is only linked to climate change. And what I mean by that is one of the scoping reviews I included was on the topic of solastalgia, which is simplistically put, nostalgia for the world that used to be, sadness and grief about the change brought by climate change and environmental degradation. So it's intrinsically a climate change topic. So my results were 8 completed reviews and 2 protocols. And I found that only one of the reviews came anywhere close to defining what they meant by climate change, in that they talked about climate factors, such as meteorological parameters and extreme weather events and air pollution, but didn't provide information about kind of how some of their decision-making processes, which is what I really needed. Okay, so time went by. I set aside this scoping review and got on with life a little bit. And in the meantime, as was mentioned in the introduction, I got involved in a working group within the Cochrane collaboration around looking at climate change and health. And some of these methods, questions that had provoked my scoping review came back to me. So now I've come back to this whole question of how do you do rigorous, proper, relevant, whatever the word you want to use is, evidence syntheses on climate health topics, with a very much more nuanced understanding of why this is really hard. And one of the big issues is that the methods for health evidence syntheses that have been developed by groups like Cochrane, that have been developed to be very rigorous and really strong, but they're always looking backwards. If you're comparing drug A to drug B, in terms of reduction of length of stay in hospital, for example, that all happened in the past. We know what happened. This group had this length of stay, this group had that length of stay, it's all done. But when we talk about climate change, intrinsically, we're talking about the future. And we have deep uncertainty on how outcomes will unfold in a particular time and space, and how those outcomes will be affected by other things, such as what the world does to mitigate climate change or adapt to it. So it's an entirely different approach to time and space. As well, health methods have been developed for health studies, which makes sense. But when you're looking at climate change and health, and the impacts, it requires integrating multiple lines of evidence from different disciplines in order to contextualize the health information and develop actionable policy relevant information, which, as I mentioned, is the point of doing the synthesis in the first place. You're not typically doing it just to publish it and forget about it. Health impacts are hugely mediated by social, physical, and economic factors. So what can be devastating for somebody in one a socioeconomic group or one country, can be much more manageable living in a more affluent country, or if you're in a more higher socioeconomic class. Also, existing work carried out by health researchers, I don't know why that says carried about, it's not what I meant at all, but gently put, reveals a limited understanding of weather and climate science, and an ongoing confusion about the differences between weather, climate, and climate change. And this is where we need to bring health together with health sphere together with work done in detection and attribution. And I think health researchers have been a little slow to develop methods, adequate methods, sorry. Okay, so future methods development. We need an evidence base around how to, pardon me, create evidence syntheses. First and foremost, these have to be relevant for decision makers' needs at a range of levels, from local to international government and other policy maker needs. As I've mentioned, we need to appropriately integrate the tenets of climate science with those of health science, bring those two really strong fields together, and what can they learn from each other, and develop methods around incorporating a range of study designs, including for future-focused work such as modeling studies and projections. Okay, so just to close, I'd like to acknowledge Christy Ebi at the University of Washington is on my PhD committee and has been extremely helpful, and Dr. Amanda Newton at the U of A, who is my supervisor. So if you have any questions or either now or at the end, that's great. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks very much, Denise, for the presentation. Really interesting challenges which you're obviously facing throughout your work as a PhD student, and it's really interesting to see that you're doing a lot of work with the Cochrane as well. So hopefully there'll be a lot of talk about these kinds of challenges, and you're able to share your experiences on that wider platform. So I'm just looking at the questions coming in now, and just to see whether we have any more. So at the moment, it seems that we are okay for questions. So if you do have any questions, please do, as I say, here we've got one from one of our attendees. She's asking whether there is some guidance now in the interim as to how to define the eligibility criteria for climate change.
I know there's a group at the University of Leeds that is starting to look at this. I'm not sure whether they've reached the stage of publishing what they've done yet, but I'm not aware of any other guidance that's been completed in this area. So that's why I'm hoping to contribute a bit over by doing that by means of my PhD work.
Thanks, Denise. We've also got another question. So it's come in saying, could somebody from Kimberly Bauman, could somebody type out that word that meant nostalgia about how the world used to be?
Yeah, I don't know if I can type it, but it was solastalgia. So SOLASTALGIA. Yeah, so it was originated by an Australian scholar named Glenn Albrecht, ALBRECHT. But a lot of people have picked the idea up and done more with it since then.
Great, thanks, Denise. Yeah, really interesting concept there.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard a lot about that one as well. Thanks so much, Denise, for that presentation. We'll be returning to you shortly. Looking forward to it already. And now I've got the slightly strange task of introducing myself. Last minute, I was going to have to cancel this my presentation and my chairing of this session and hand it over to someone else, but I was able to join it in the end. So hence why I've actually recorded my talk, and we're going to play that now, just because I've managed to keep to time in that talk, which isn't necessarily what I might be able to do if I'm just speaking freehand. So to introduce myself, I'm a research fellow at the University of Exeter in the UK at the centre called the European Centre for the Environment and Human Health. I've been working in evidence synthesis in the environmental field since 2009, and I've got a background as an environmental scientist and also in evidence synthesis methodology since 2009. And my current work is mostly about capacity building at the moment, as well as producing evidence syntheses. I'm supporting my colleagues in Southeast Asia as part of a research programme, which I'll tell you more about shortly, to undertake systematic reviews in the area of marine management and conservation, with a focus on impacts on human health and well-being. So I'll just have my talk played now. Hi there, and thanks for attending this presentation. I'm really sorry I'm not with you in person, and I'm just about to minimize my video here just so that you can see more of my screen. So my talk is called Healthy Ocean, Happy People, Mapping the Evidence for Marine Conservation Links with Health and Wellbeing in Tropical Southeast Asia. We know that marine conservation is often aimed to tackle the dual challenge of both improving the marine environment and human well-being, and this in particular in low and middle income countries. However, there's growing concern over the extent to which this dual goal has actually been achieved, and an increasing recognition of the trade-offs involved when attempting to succeed at both of these quite ambitious goals. The available evidence on the success of marine conservation has typically lacked documentation for a number of reasons, including limited resources for monitoring and evaluation, and the difficulty in bringing together a disparate evidence base. To address this research need, we've catalogued all the available research that we can find that has aimed to answer the question, how has marine conservation management affected the health and well-being of coastal communities in Southeast Asia? We're focusing on Southeast Asia because it's a hotspot for biodiversity, and it's under increasing pressure from a burgeoning population, overseas demand from seafood, and has long been a focal area, in fact, for marine conservation. Our work also targets the SDG goals shown here, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Another reason why we've focused on Southeast Asia is because this project is part of a wider £6 million 4-year programme of research named Blue Communities. And the aims of that programme are to build capacity for sustainable interactions with marine ecosystems for the benefit of health, well-being and livelihoods of coastal communities in Southeast Asia. We've got a number of wonderful partners on board there, both based in the UK and in Southeast Asia, and also a number of NGO partners contributing as well. So the Blue Community goals are actually being achieved through a number of transdisciplinary projects, but the evidence synthesis programme really focuses on the very baseline of this and asks, what do we already know about this topic? To achieve this goal, we used a team of reviewers using the well-recognised systematic mapping methods to find peer-reviewed and published research and also identify grey literature on the topic. So here I'm showing the first part of our roses diagram, similar to a prisma diagram, if you may be more familiar with those. We searched a number of bibliographic databases to find published literature, We identified grey literature through institutional and organisational website searches and key stakeholders. And we also found records which had already been identified from previous work by the Science for Nature and People Partnership. We assessed over 37,000 records after duplicates were removed. And as we move down through the Prisma diagram or Rose's diagram, you can see this kind of continuing on. The full diagram is shown in our research paper, which is forthcoming, but didn't quite fit on one slide here. After a number of screening processes where we assessed against a number of predefined eligibility criteria, we did assess about 1,300 articles at full text and found 281 studies which were relevant and were included in our systematic map. We extracted the metadata from these on the design and characteristics of each study, from which we produced an interactive database and map and a narrative summary. This is probably a point at which I could say why we chose to do a systematic map on this topic, and that's because the topic is very broad in itself, and we wanted to work out where the areas were which had been well studied, where the areas were which had less information about them. So those knowledge clusters and knowledge gaps could be used to inform future research, both secondary, systematic reviews, and primary research. So let's move on to what we actually found. So this is a map with some bars on it showing the number of studies which were identified from different countries in the Southeast Asia region. And from our 281 studies, most of these were actually peer-reviewed publications, over 90%, and most were actually undertaken in the Philippines or in Indonesia. In terms of the types of studies, we found slightly more quantitative than qualitative studies, 45% compared to 31%, and 24% of studies which were actually both qualitative and quantitative studies. However, despite the importance of having a control group, which we know, particularly for quantitative studies, only 24% of those studies contained one. Now moving over to the heat map, which tells us quite a lot of information. So this heat map shows knowledge clusters and gaps across 7 marine conservation intervention categories, shown here along the left-hand side, and 10 human health and well-being outcome categories, shown along the bottom. The values within the boxes indicate the number of studies, and we have coloured it with various shades of green, whereby the darker shades show that there's more studies and the lighter shades show that there's fewer studies. This is a heat map. The bars along both sides show the percentage representation of the marine conservation interventions and the human health and well-being outcomes in the systematic map in total. So you can see which ones were more popularly studied. So we identified a number of knowledge clusters, one of these being the marine conservation intervention of site protection. And this includes things like marine protected areas, a very typically studied conservation intervention. As you can see, much darker green colours in those boxes. And this is in preference over, for example, education, awareness and activism, which you can see there is much lighter in colour, much fewer studies investigating that intervention. In terms of knowledge clusters where studies investigated links between the interventions and outcomes, we can see that these were typically across the categories of economic livelihood incentives and alternatives, habitat management and site protection in terms of marine conservation. And for human health and well-being outcomes, it was economic living standards, governance and empowerment, and social relations. These boxes you can see are all slightly darker. We also found that amongst these, the quantitative studies more often looked at economic living standards, and that the qualitative studies more often were assessing the impact of marine conservation categories on governance and empowerment or social relations. We also identified a number of major evidence gaps, typically in terms of human health and well-being categories. So culture and spirituality, freedom of choice and action, health, security and safety, and subjective well-being were all unfortunately pretty poorly represented in the database. So we would definitely recommend that there's more research undertaken in these topic areas. So alongside our research paper, which, as I mentioned, will be published soon, hopefully, we've produced an online interactive map. And this is an evidence map which is available at the website shown below. A user can go to this website, open the map, click on any of the points coloured here, and up pops a box just like this one, which indicates which study it was, where it was undertaken, a number of other important key details about that study, and also contains a link to where that paper may be obtained. We think this is a really useful tool, not just for our research partners, but for practitioners and other researchers around the world. It's a freely available and accessed database of information. Alongside this, we also have an input sheet, an input spreadsheet, which can be used in the website, which contains the software for Evi Atlas. So Evi Atlas is a tool to create evidence maps and also to create visualized databases of studies such as these. And this information can be accessed by using the input file, which will be published alongside our research paper, which is also open access. So with the information that we found, in particular the information about the knowledge clusters, we undertook some workshopping sessions with our research partners in Southeast Asia, who are now continuing forward and now well on their way to producing systematic reviews based on these knowledge clusters, so looking at economic and livelihood, health and well-being outcomes, and also looking at focusing on site protection, UNESCO reserves, and also governance and empowerment. So we're really focusing on some of those topics which we covered and found in our systematic map. So in summary, we have presented here the first updatable, interrogable and comprehensive evidence map on this topic for Southeast Asia. The work that we've done supports further detailed investigation of these knowledge clusters, as our research partners are doing right now, and also serves to identify some of the understudied topic areas so that primary researchers can focus on these. The lack of comparative quantitative studies that we found, as I mentioned, suggests that future research should include counterfactuals to strengthen the robustness of the evidence base. We should also note that users of this systematic map should recognise that much evidence may be national or locally specific, and that, in fact, we didn't undertake an assessment of study quality, which is something that's quite common in a systematic map. So when considering implications for policy and decision making using the systematic map, our users should really carefully consider the heterogeneity of the available evidence and refer back to the original research articles of interest to them to gain a fuller depth of understanding and context. As I mentioned, our peer review publication is forthcoming in the journal Environment International. It's in the final stages of review, and I'd like to say a very big thank you on behalf of the whole research team for attending this presentation, and I look forward to fielding questions via Ruth Garside or myself. Thanks very much.
Oh, you're muted, Jackie. Sorry, I still can't hear you. There, try that.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm not really sure what went on there. So I can confirm that our paper has been accepted into publication today. I just had the information about that from the editors, so that will be forthcoming soon. If anyone needs any more information about that before the publication, then drop me a line and I can share some information with you. I've also put up the web address for our interactive evidence atlas in the web chat. So apologies for the microphone issues there. Let's move on to our next speaker, who is Matt Lloyd-Jones. Matt's also a postdoctoral researcher at the same centre as I am, so that's the University of Exeter in the UK, and it's the European Centre for the Environment and Human Health. Matt is currently working on a systematic review and meta-analysis of studies which are looking at the effect of antibiotics use on antibiotic resistance in beef cattle production. And this is a part of a BBRS SRC UK Argentina project. Matt's a microbial ecologist who's previously worked between the lab and computer at Imperial College's Silwood Park, that's Imperial College London, and that's where he did his PhD on the invasion ecology of microbial communities. As well as evidence synthesis, Matt is more generally interested in community ecology, antimicrobial resistance, and applications of technology to address human and animal health issues. So over to Matt.
Thanks for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, okay, so, sorry, I'm just trying to arrange my screen. Yeah, I've changed my original title a little bit. It was a bit more grandiose when I submitted it, but yeah, since I started the project, it's become a bit more specific. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be basically talking about some just sort of quite casual reflections on designing a systematic review protocol about microbes, antibiotic resistance, and also dealing with time series data. Yeah, so as Jackie introduced, this is part of a UK Argentina project funded by BBSRC with CONICET in Argentina. And yeah, it's an international team of well, some people with expertise in systematic review and others in microbiology and veterinary sciences. And the general project is a mix of evidence synthesis, field work and lab work to try and understand the link between antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance in beef cattle production, particularly in feedlots. Yeah, so the structure of the talk, I'll just give you a little bit of background on the project and why we're doing a systematic review on this topic. And then I'm going to sort of highlight some sort of problems with the existing evidence base on this, which we are trying to address, and we've tried to address in our protocol, systematic review protocol and subsequent review. Oh, sorry. Okay, so if you don't know that much about antibiotic resistance, livestock and the environment, so the problem of antibiotic resistance in the environment is increasingly coming on the environmental agenda. In particular, there's concern about the use of antibiotics in agriculture and particularly livestock production, and how residues of those antibiotics and also antibiotic resistant organisms from those animals could spread into the environment and to humans, particularly through poo. So yeah, most of this stuff is, most of the concern is around livestock feces and that contaminating the environment. And there's been a lot of studies on antibiotic resistant bacteria in livestock feces. And so sort of the first step in trying to understand the potential health risk of environmental contamination is to characterize antibiotic resistance microbes emerging from livestock production in feces in particular. And yeah, I don't know what I was going to say there, but yeah. So yeah, beef in particular is quite interesting because compared to a lot of livestock sectors, it's usually been seen as quite a low risk of producing antibiotic resistant organisms. And that's because compared to things like pig and poultry production, there's a lot less antibiotic use. But recently, well, not that recently, but we've seen the sort of growth of more intensive beef production systems, particularly beef feedlots. And those sort of emerged in Canada and the USA. I think they're pretty big in Alberta. Yeah, they're sort of being exported around the world in the last 20 years or so, particularly to Latin America and South America and other places. And so this concern, as you move to this more intensive system that which uses a lot more antibiotics than conventional agriculture, that there's more risk of antibiotic resistance emerging from beef production. Yeah, so, but there's a bit of a difficulty in establishing a cause-effect relationship between antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance emerging in beef production, particularly because feedlot production is such a fundamentally different production process compared to grass-fed beef, for example, that we don't really know what's causing the changes, even if we observe higher levels of antibiotic resistance in feedlots. Yeah, so our goal is to sort of assess this question of, and to try and estimate the cause-effect relationship between antibiotic use in beef production and antibiotic resistance using the available literature. And that available literature, there's quite a lot of good studies out there with a sort of longitudinal design where they would apply an antibiotic to a group of cattle and then track them over time and compare them to a group that didn't receive that antibiotic. And particularly they're looking to measure the numbers of resistant bacteria or resistance genes in their feces. And there's been some previous work to try and use, so there's lots of these good studies, and there's been some previous work to try and understand what they're all saying in terms of reviewing them. But currently the reviews out there are minimal, and they have tended not to be underpinned by an extensive systematic review protocol, and they sort of underutilize time series and longitudinal data in particular. And there's some more specific issues with them associated with sort of microbiological techniques and how they're being handled in evidence synthesis, but I've sort of left them out for now because this is a more general audience. Yeah, so this idea of them not being underpinned by an extensive systematic review protocol, so I haven't named the studies, but yeah, there's basically two main studies that are similarly looking at this question of the relationship between antibiotic use and resistance in beef cattle production. And one of them sort of didn't use a systematic search strategy or screening process, and it was more of a narrative assessment of the evidence. And the other one is an unpublished study, and they sort of only identified 344 studies in their initial searches, which is quite low compared to what we ended up finding. And they did not publish their systematic review protocol. So yeah, so both of these studies seem to suggest there is a relationship, which kind of makes sense. but because it's not underpinned by systematic review processes, it's a bit difficult to know, to be confident in that conclusion. So yeah, in our approach, with the protocol we designed, it sort of highlights the benefit of working with an experienced systematic review team that we have at the University of Exeter, particularly an information specialist or librarian with experience. So we had Alison Bethel on board, who's also on Jackie's project, who did some really extensive searches in lots of different databases, and sort of a much more rigorous process of scoping out the literature and checking that we've found all the literature that's really there. And then there's also, in our project, which is between the UK and Argentina, there's an emphasis on non-English searches. So I mentioned earlier that this feedlot production, these feedlot facilities are moving to South America and growing in South America and Argentina in particular. And so it's important to do our searches in Spanish and Portuguese in Latin American databases as well. So doing that. And also, yeah, the importance of pre-registering a sort of really extensive protocol before you do the study. So yeah, we've done that in Open Science Framework. There's also Collaboration for Environmental Evidence's own processes of doing that in the Environmental Evidence Journal. Yeah, and I sort of reflected on that. We went for the Open Science Framework option just because we wanted to be a little more flexible at the time. But yeah, it's really sort of, it's not clear how to do that always. So there needs to be, so I think there needs to be some more instructions on how to do that and more diversity of ways to do it. So yeah, I made some of those instructions that I'll put in the chat for OSF. Yeah, and then there's this second point about time series data. So if we look at these studies and we look at what they're measuring, typically you have an antibiotic that's either injected in the first panel here, and then you see a sort of well, we hypothesized you'd see kind of a spike in resistance immediately after injection, and then sort of a decay of that as time goes on without antibiotic administration. Antibiotics are also administered to cattle in feed, so in their food, and with that there's sort of a continuous administration of antibiotics, which has implications for probably different kinds of temporal dynamics. So because the pressure isn't released at any time. And then in this third panel, there's a sort of different way of looking at the effect of antibiotic use on resistance. Is what is the effect after you remove the antibiotic administration? So that's more the decay after the disturbance or the antibiotic use is observed. So yeah, there's lots of this in the literature, but I think perhaps because of just the way that evidence synthesis has emerged and evolved, time series tend to be quite underutilized, and there's not really often talked about ways of standard procedures for analyzing them. So yeah, there's difficulties in particular around handling repeated measures designs with repeated measures on the same individuals, which are not statistically independent. Yeah, as I said, this is also associated with the medical origins of meta-analysis, where perhaps in some cases at least, there was perhaps less a need to look at the whole time series. Yeah, so the conventional approaches for dealing with this kind of time series data is either to choose a single time point of interest, where, so if you imagine in this graph on the right, we have the colors are different studies and time is on the x-axis, and whatever you're measuring in terms of your response is on the y. Then you perhaps pick a time point where all the studies that all of the studies shared, for example, or that is of clinical significance. But by doing that, you lose a lot of information, and the exact time points differ between studies, so it's difficult. And then the other approach is sort of to split a time series into different time bins, perhaps with, again, clinical significance or something like that. But yeah, the problem with this, again, you sort of lose information with certain studies or time points within studies falling outside of those bins. You miss temporal effects, and it's often not clear which bins are of interest and how large you make those bins, and those decisions can really affect the conclusion of your meta-analysis. So yeah, this was a similar study in humans that used that second technique I mentioned of splitting up the time series into separate bins. Yeah, and it's also not the most intuitive thing to communicate. So ideally, you want a way of looking at the whole time series and analysing it together. And this is what we're kind of used to in environmental studies, where for academic or practical reasons, so because we're interested in things like disturbance, which you can't really define as by one time point or certain bins, and also for practical reasons, often different studies, especially in ecology and environmental sciences, they differ in when they measure things. So yeah, this kind of thing is probably more suited to a mixed modeling approach, where you explicitly deal with time as a random nested effect nested within study, and so you can understand the effect of time, but also understand how much of that is due to the particular studies you're looking at. And then there's also, with this mixed modeling approach, you can also look at other effects alongside it as mediators or fixed effects. So for antibiotic resistance, dose and the class of antibiotic administered is particularly important. Yeah, so that's kind of the things we tried to take into account in our protocol, which is now pre-registered on Open Science Framework. And yeah, we've done the abstract screening and we're on to the full text. Questions?
Great, thanks, Matt. Some very familiar problems that you mentioned there. They're very familiar to me, so I feel your pain. It's very complicated looking at these kinds of data sets, as you found out through your scoping. So good luck with the project.
Yeah. I'll be needing.
So if any questions come in for you, Matt, I will send them on. But I think it's now time to move on to our next speaker, and I can confirm that I found out why I managed to mute myself. I think I leaned with my elbow on some microphone controls, so the benefits and challenges of working online. We've actually got Denise again now. So Denise Thompson, who you may well remember, if this is for anybody who's joining us again, Denise is a PhD student at the University of Alberta in Canada. She's looking at evidence synthesis methods, assessing the health impacts of climate change. She's very well experienced in health promotion and health research, having worked in it for about 20 years, and she's working with the Cochrane collaboration at the moment. So I'm just going to hand over to Denise. So looking forward to your talk.
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself. So hello again, everyone. Since the sun is just coming up here, comes up at about 9:15 these days. So my first presentation happened in the dark, and now I'm in sunshine. So it feels kind of neat. So this presentation, as you can see from the title, is about evidence syntheses, and about climate health impacts, and particularly search strategies. So there's two people at the outset who I'd really like to acknowledge as in this work. One is Candice Ramjohn, who's the artist, whose art is included in this presentation. So an earlier version of this talk was designed as a poster for the Cochrane Colloquium in 2019. And Candace did our entire poster and as a comic strip, and it was just fantastic. And unfortunately, the Cochrane Colloquium was canceled the day before it was due to start, and so we never got to show the poster. So I've incorporated many of the graphics from it in this presentation because they're too wonderful to waste. The other person I want to acknowledge is Liz Dennett, who's an information specialist at the Scott Health Sciences Library at the University of Alberta, and she actually has a starring role in our comic strip, as you will see, as our superhero. But yeah, without her expertise and insight, we really would have been in trouble, as you'll see. Okay, so I have no conflict of interest to declare. So the objective of this is to present the challenges in creating our search strategy when we did a scoping review of the evidence of the effectiveness of health co-benefits of climate change adaptation measures. And that's a really complex topic, which I can't fully explain or do justice to in this presentation, beyond reflecting the fact that it was complex, and that's what made the work of the search strategy tricky. Okay, next slide. Oops. Okay, so this is our superhero and our information specialist. So what do I mean by information specialist? So this is a term, often these people used to be called librarians, but the newer term seems to be information specialist. So one of the things they can do very well is develop search strategies, looking for evidence to include in evidence syntheses, and their training, either at a master's or PhD level, is typically in library and information science. Okay, so the presentation is about methods for search strategies. So what do I mean by search strategy? So search strategy is the way a search is carried out to identify publications or reports that are relevant for an evidence synthesis, such as a systematic review or scoping review. And it's important to do a search thoroughly to minimize bias and increase the quality of the review. So in my day job, I run a service providing knowledge synthesis support for researchers. And a lot of the time, people, surprisingly often, people come and they just want a librarian just to run a search in Google Scholar. No big deal. It'll take them 2 hours, you know, and that's all the time this person's willing to pay for. And so we have to explain, no, Google Scholar is not enough. It can be one place you check, but you need Medline, you need all these databases, and you need someone who really knows how to do that search properly. It's not just a matter of throwing a few terms into a search box. There's a complete science to this, and your search has to be adapted for each database that you use. So you need expertise. So the primary research question for our scoping review was looking at climate adaptation interventions and looking at ones that had been evaluated for their impact on human health. So this is a very broad, complex question because you have to find, first of all, you have to do a search for, sorry, I have a squeaky door in the background. First of all, you have to do the search for the climate adaptation interventions, which is a really broad topic. Then you need to find the intersection with human health, and then in that intersection, a measure of evaluation. So it's not a straightforward work. So presenting this partly because it's just a fantastic piece of art, and partly to very briefly explain the breadth of the impacts that climate change has on health. So in the top left corner, you see the direct impacts, such as heat stroke from heat waves, or mental health impacts from say bushfires, wildfires, loss of homes, and so on. In the top right corner, we see impacts in natural systems, such as the spread of vector-borne diseases. If you're watching on a small screen, you may not see the very beautifully rendered mosquito on that red arrow, but it is there. Then the bottom, a range of socioeconomic issues, such as increased conflict from decreased resources or forced migration or so on. So addressing, I've shown you the breadth of health impacts, and so addressing those is broad for two reasons, or at least two reasons, possibly more. The extensive range of health impacts requires an extensive range of potentially relevant policies and programs. And as well, many climate change adaptation initiatives can have health co-benefits, and sometimes those are planned, and sometimes they're incidental. They weren't planned. So briefly to explain what I mean by a scoping review, I find the term scoping review is not often used outside of health, or if it is, it's used in a different way than we mean in health. I won't go into it in great detail, but there's quite well-defined methods for it, and it's a way of doing a review when you have a broad question, such as we did in this, with a broad range of study designs. So it typically does not include a quantitative synthesis, such as a systematic review often would include. So our inclusion criteria for this search were, as I've said, we wanted interventions for adapting to climate change that had some evaluation of health co-benefits. That was very tricky to design the search for this. You see our superhero here is in this vast library of climate change research asking, where do I even begin with this? So there was a lot of back and forth with our team. We had subject matter experts in climate change and health. We had methods experts on doing evidence syntheses, and then we had our superhero information specialist who asked us a lot of questions and went through numerous iterations of the search. So one of the challenges was simply developing a working definition and a list of search terms. So when I say a working definition, I mean, we know what climate change is, we know what climate change adaptation is, there's lots of definitions of those terms around, but translating that into a definition that could be operationalized for a search strategy and an accompanying list of search terms was a huge job, and required a lot of scoping too, because climate change isn't just a single thing. It's more and more a description of the way we live in the 21st century. And as you've seen, the health impacts are so broad. We had to scope the scoping review so that it didn't become overwhelmingly unfeasible. As well, Liz had to create a filter for a wide range of study designs, which was broader than might typically be included in a health-related scoping review. And we had to spend a lot of time talking about the wide range of activities that can be considered as adaptation initiatives. So adapting to climate change is everything from bringing in a heat health warning system to tell people to be careful because there's a heat wave starting, can be building a seawall around your city to avoid impacts from the higher sea levels, or initiatives around bushfires and wildfires. I mean, you get the idea. Climate change adaptation is a huge thing. And then another challenge was teasing out health benefits from other benefits, social, economic, or environmental benefits. And you know, health is a broad concept with I typically call it kind of a squishy concept, because there's stuff that's very clearly health related, there's stuff that's very clearly not health, but then there's that kind of squishy zone in the middle where you know, you can have health benefits that are also really bound up in, say, education or social welfare or so on. And again, where do you set the limit? You can't do, by definition, an evidence synthesis has to have boundaries. Then we spent a lot of time with the team in talking about studies that were relevant, but that were not explicitly described as being related to climate change. And so we had discussions and decisions that we had to make around how to capture those. And again, you know, many of you will have done evidence syntheses, and you'll be aware that every decision you make about your scope brings with it you know, the chance of the butterfly that will get away, right? Like this study that might be relevant that you're not going to find. And so, yeah, and it was more of an issue in this than in many scoping reviews where stuff might be more clearly categorized through keywords or text in the abstract or so on. So we addressed these, as I've said, with a lot of iteration and team discussion. And our superhero, our information specialist, is someone with a lot of experience. She'd done a lot of searches for a lot of different health-related evidence syntheses. And she told me at the end this had been one of the most challenging searches of her career. She said she loved it. She had a great time. She appreciated doing something outside the normal or outside her usual scope, but it was very challenging and it was time consuming. And it certainly highlighted, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, people who still think that Google Scholar is your start and end point for an evidence synthesis. This was, you know, this experience was very illuminating in terms of why you work with somebody with the degree of training that an information specialist has. So in conclusion, the complexity and seriousness of climate change health impacts mean we need innovative and high quality methods for evidence synthesis in this realm, and that well-designed search strategies are a fundamental component of those innovative methods. And we need to think about the complexities of designing the search strategies to help contribute to the work of creating an effective and ongoing response to climate change. A lot of acknowledgements here. As you'll see in this list, Liz Dennett is listed as number 3, and I've put a note for Candace at the bottom because of this incredible art, which is just so much fun. And yeah, so that's it. And again, if there's time for questions, can take them now or at the end. Thanks. Oops.
Great, thanks so much again, Denise, for that wonderful presentation. And I do agree, those cartoons really bring it to life. So I'd really like to thank your illustration person as well. And again, some of those challenges are very familiar to me as well. Challenges of searching always come into almost every review that you do. And it's wonderful to have those, as you say, superheroes to bring things together. We just have a question or a comment here from one of our participants. She says, Denise, you're using awesome art. Is there any possibility to reuse this art with the proper citations?
Reusing it in terms of crediting Candace on every slide? Is that the question?
I believe so.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. So thanks.
I think perhaps her question was, is it possible for her to take the art and use it in
I
her own work? Yeah.
Maybe if the person could contact me and we could talk about it, because I haven't actually thought about that, and I'd want to check with Candace on her comfort level and so on.
Of course. Yeah, we can put you in contact after the webinar.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So some more appreciation coming in from Sumaya Deep as well for the presentation. So thanks very much, Denise. Another fantastic presentation.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll just move on to our penultimate speaker. Rachel Buxton is a conservation scientist at Carleton University, Ottawa in Canada. She's aiming to support conservation policy and practice with robust evidence. Her main research interests include soundscapes, seabirds, and systematic conservation planning. She focuses on the impact of noise pollution and the benefits of natural sound, quantifying the relationship between sound and biodiversity patterns, and the importance of the acoustic environment for the health of wildlife and humans. She also examines information gaps to achieve biodiversity conservation targets in Canada. Rachel's working with groups of practitioners, decision makers and stakeholders to ensure her research is applicable for mobilising effective conservation solutions. And I'm confident the sound is working correctly for Rachel in her presentation, because I know we're going to be using that a lot. So over to you, Rachel.
Great, thanks a lot. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Great, so thanks so much everyone for tuning in this morning or afternoon. My name is Dr. Rachel Buxton. I'm a conservation scientist at Carleton University in Ottawa, and I'm really excited to speak to you this morning about the health benefits of natural soundscapes, despite these exceptional circumstances that we find ourselves in. But in a lot of ways, the current pandemic has really emphasized the importance of nature for human health. For natural sounds in particular, as air and vehicle traffic have declined during quarantine, many people have experienced and connected with soundscapes in a whole new way. And as I'll outline in my talk, it turns out that experiencing natural soundscapes can have substantial benefits for our health. So sounds are all around us. Natural sounds like this dawn chorus, they're beautiful. They make us feel relaxed. Hopefully they're making you feel a little bit more relaxed on this Tuesday morning or afternoon. But the sounds of nature have long generated powerful reactions in humans, from inspiring music and poetry like Beethoven's symphonies, to providing the stark symbolism that ignited the environmental movement. I'm thinking of Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring. Sounds confer a sense of place, and they connect people to nature. But importantly, soundscapes provide crucial information for both wildlife and humans. Many species rely on sound to communicate, and sound perception enables most species, including humans, to surveil their surroundings. For some animals, like the mouse in this video, hearing sounds can mean the difference between life and death. So first of all, what is a soundscape? A soundscape is the collection of sounds that we perceive in an environment, including those from biological sources like birdsong, geophysical sounds like those from wind and rain, and human-made sounds or noise, including noise from road and air traffic. Now, the health benefits of exposure to nature are very well documented, from improving birth outcomes to reducing mortality rates, improving our mental health, and improving the rate of a myriad of diseases. But while the benefits of viewing nature are more studied, the influence of the acoustic environment is really an emerging area of research. And it's emerging as an important mechanism through which contact with nature affects human health. So how could natural soundscapes improve our health? Well, if we think of this in an evolutionary context, humans attend to patterns that signal danger and security, where natural acoustic environments provide indicators of safety, or an ordered world without danger. And this allows humans control over their mind states, reduction in stress-related behavior, and mental recuperation. Conversely, an absence of these natural safety indicators in the acoustic environment can provoke vigilance and induce a more alert or aroused state. Now, if we add an element in here, if we add anthropogenic sounds into a soundscape, this can lead to stress and can lead to a variety of different health risks for humans, including things like cardiovascular disease. So the National Park Service in the United States is one of the only federal institutions that's specifically mandated to protect soundscapes. And this is because of congressional concerns over the impact of noise. And the concern over noise actually originated because of noise that's generated by air tours in the Grand Canyon. So in parks, soundscapes are managed to minimize noise exceeding levels known to be detrimental to wildlife and visitor experience. And natural sounds are increasingly recognized as a park resource and have become the subject for conservation and management. So the objectives of our study were to first determine whether and to what degree natural sounds influence health outcomes. And to do this, we conducted a systematic literature review and meta-analysis. And given the evidence showing that natural sounds influence health, and to facilitate park soundscape management in a public health context, we then examined the distribution of natural sounds in relation to anthropogenic sounds in national parks. To do this, we used a database of recordings where different components of the soundscape had been identified at 220 sites in 68 national parks across the United States. So first, we performed an extensive literature search using Web of Science, PubMed, and Scopus. We used search terms that focused on human health and the potential benefits from natural sounds. And I do want to note here that we define human health fairly broadly. So this included more traditional outcomes like stress, but also potential precursors along the pathway to health, things like annoyance. We found a total of 36 articles that were relevant, and of these, only 18 studies had enough information for further meta-analysis. So to perform our meta-analysis, we calculated Hedges G effect sizes and fit two random effects meta-analysis models. The first was for health outcomes that natural sounds were expected to improve, things like improved mood and enhanced cognitive performance. And the next model was for health outcomes that natural sounds were expected to reduce, things like decreased pain and lower stress. And really across the board, our models demonstrated that natural sounds can improve health and positive affective outcomes and decrease stress and annoyance. We also tested for the effects of different moderators. First, there were three main types of natural sounds that were tested in the studies included in our analysis. And of these, we found that water sounds had the largest effect on improving health and positive affective outcomes, while bird sounds had the largest effect on alleviating stress and annoyance. I do want to mention that relatively few studies tested the effects of bird sound explicitly. Only 2 studies in our analysis with 11 effect sizes. So this is a really exciting avenue for further research. Now, the importance of water sounds may relate to the critical role of water for survival, and it could also be due to the capacity of continuous water sounds to mask or cover up noise. So water features have often been used as urban landscape elements. to enhance acoustic environments. Not only can sounds from water be used to mask or cover up noise, they also have been shown to increase the positive perception of urban green spaces. There were also several different comparison groups across studies, and we found that studies comparing natural sound and noise to noise alone had the largest effect on health and positive affective outcomes. And this is a really compelling result because it means that pairing natural sounds with noise may be able to improve the negative effects of noise alone. So we then examined the distribution of natural and anthropogenic sounds at 221 national park sites across the United States. And we focused on recording sites that had been analyzed by acoustic technicians. So technicians categorize different types of sounds in subsamples of recordings. And we use these categorized recordings to calculate something called audibility, or the proportion of acoustic samples where either biological, geophysical, or anthropogenic sounds were observed. We estimated low audibility as recordings where sounds were audible less than 25% of the time, and high audibility when sounds were audible more than 75% of the time. So we found at 11% of these recording sites, there was a high audibility of natural sounds and a low audibility of anthropogenic sounds. And these are sites that could represent important acoustic environments for human health. As you can see on this map, the larger dark bubbles indicate sites with high audibility of natural sounds and low audibility of anthropogenic sounds. And you can see that they're mainly distributed in Alaska, Hawaii, and the Pacific Northwest. But importantly, they're generally far from urban areas. So only 3 of the sites with high audibility of natural sounds and low audibility of anthropogenic sounds were even within 100 kilometers of urban areas. And this is because anthropogenic sounds are audible most of the time within urban areas. Excuse me. Yet many sites within urban parks also had a high audibility of natural sounds. So for these urban soundscapes, noise reduction may produce the greatest benefits for health. And this is because urban parks have high rates of visitation and represent refuges for urban visitors, especially those whose travel options are limited. So our study demonstrated the health benefits of exposure to natural sounds. There are an increasing number of nature-based health interventions, things like HARC prescriptions. And given ongoing soundscape monitoring in national parks, there's really ample opportunity to incorporate soundscape quality into these initiatives to enhance health outcomes. So natural soundscapes are increasingly threatened because of the rapid loss of sound-producing organisms like birds and the intrusion of noise. So our study really emphasizes the importance of managing soundscapes through noise management and raising awareness about the importance of natural sounds. So I want to say a big thank you to all my collaborators through the National Park Service and Michigan State University, as well as at Colorado State University. If I don't get to answer any of your questions here, I'm happy if you want to reach out on Twitter or send me an email. And if you'd like to keep in touch about future work in this area, please do check out the website for our current project in Detroit. Thanks a lot, everyone.
That's great. Thanks very much for your talk, Rachel. Some really interesting topics coming up there. We don't have huge amounts of time for questions, so if and when they come in, we will forward them on to you. And as you said, Cheryl's Twitter handle and things were up there, so if you want to get in touch directly, I think she'll be very happy to chat. So thanks so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
And I'd like to introduce now our final speaker. So Pua'ala Pascua is a biodiversity scientist and biocultural specialist at the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. And that's based at the American Museum of Natural History in Washington, DC in the USA. Pua'ala is of native Hawaiian descent, and she was born, raised, and currently resides in Hawaii. So Pua'ala is not able to join us today, but we do have some of our colleagues here available online to answer any questions. So do keep those questions coming in if they do arise. And apologies here, I've just got that wrong. The American Museum of Natural History, of course, is in New York City, and not the one that I visited and found very interesting in Washington, DC. Apologies for that. So let's move on to the recorded talk from Pua'ala.
Ano ai me ke aloha nui a ka koa pau. My name is Pua'ala Pascua, and while I apologize for not being able to join you live today, it's my pleasure to share our lessons learned exploring well-being through connections between and across people and place on behalf of myself and my colleagues Eleanor Sterling and Samantha Chang at the American Museum of Natural History's Center for Biodiversity and Conservation. At the CBC, we have a number of initiatives centered around transforming knowledge from diverse sources and perspectives into conservation action. Together with many of our partners and collaborators, we firmly believe that improving and maintaining healthy human and ecological communities requires a thorough understanding of the social, economic, cultural, and environmental connections that exist between people and their surroundings. In order to do so, we synthesize evidence across multiple data sets toward better understanding the multidimensional factors that drive human health and environmental well-being. One important aspect of our approach is that our data sets encompass diverse knowledge systems. For example, lived and experienced knowledge or tacit knowledge, Indigenous and local knowledge, as well as the data one might find in peer-reviewed and gray literature data sources. In the field of natural resource management, indicators represent observations and resulting metrics that help us to monitor and communicate about the condition of something in order to make better decisions. This slide, which was compiled for one of our previous projects, shows some of the indicators one might typically encounter when working with the topics of environmental health and human well-being. As you can see, these indicators help us to measure things like the state of something, perhaps the number or percent area covered. They also help us to monitor trends. Are things getting better or worse? However, as one of our colleagues notes in her 2019 publication, Dax et al. 2019, indicators are also very valuable for their ability to help us measure perceptions, knowledge, and practice as a result of a management intervention. One very important point I'd like to stress here is that indicators do not always represent reality. And what I mean by that is what indicators are measured and how they're measured are dependent on the value system framing the indicator development process. The value system of those creating and measuring indicators could be quite different from the value system of the community in which the indicator monitoring is occurring. This can have substantial consequences on the ground, in particular at the local scale, because of mismatched value, potentially resulting in the misdirection of resources or funds, and in worst cases, changes in existing local value systems in a way that's not beneficial. We see this quite frequently among efforts that heavily depend on the use of gross domestic product, or GDP, as a representation of well-being, which is helpful in some places, but in others, it can become problematic if GDP is not the best measure of well-being. An example is, for instance, among subsistence communities. Through numerous projects with our partners and collaborators over the years, we've explored this challenge in greater depth in an effort to identify locally and culturally attuned indicators and approaches. To provide an example from one of our outreach materials, our collaborators experienced pretty significant challenges when surveying local community members about food security, because some of the questions that they were being required to ask by typical food security organizations were perceived as very culturally insensitive, culturally inappropriate. For example, questions like, do people ever reduce the size of a child's meal because there wasn't enough food? Or did children skip meals because there wasn't enough food? And in those settings, it's really inappropriate to talk about a parent's inability to provide food for their children. In thinking through this challenge and working with our collaborators, we posed the question of perhaps instead collecting qualitative information on questions that highlight resilience factors within a community. For instance, we have questions like, how do people ensure that they can access food after a tropical cyclone? What knowledge sources for identifying, locating, and acquiring emergency food sources exist? Also, who holds that knowledge and how is it passed on? One set of partners that we work with on this topic is the Science for Nature and People Partnership, or SNAP, Working Group on Assessing Biocultural Indicators of Resilience in the Pacific. This working group brought together an interdisciplinary network of researchers, practitioners, resource managers, and policy specialists to examine relationships among local to global metrics that center on human and environmental resilience and well-being. The CBC also co-coordinates a global group focused on this topic, whose full name is the Action Group on Knowledge Systems and Indicators of Well-Being, or the Action Group for short. More about this group can be found at our webpage, amnh.org/action-group. The 2018 meeting in New York City engaged nearly 100 participants in a cross-cutting exploration of knowledge and well-being themes in a forum that encouraged collective sharing and learning to build and support a community of practitioners. Participants included advocates, policymakers, researchers, and conservation professionals from Indigenous and local communities and groups who work closely with those communities. Coming from diverse geographic areas, including Africa, Asia, the Pacific, Europe, and the Americas. Based on the success of our 2018 meeting, we then convened a follow-up with a targeted set of participants in 2019. This engaged about 20 Indigenous peoples and local community participants representing organizations and initiatives across North America, Russia, Central Asia, and the Pacific. Through these collaborations and conversations over the years, and drawing from complementary work by our partners in this field, we identified numerous locally and culturally attuned indicators. For example, some of the ones you see here. Things like trends in the number of households and communities that are able to move around between different production activities and locations that's necessary. Things like the extent to which families have others they can rely on in times of need and neighbors they can trust. We also heard from numerous participants some indicators that at face value may seem a little nuanced, unique, reflective perhaps, like the two that you see here. For example, my children leave food on my neighbor's porch, or children sing songs to their favorite cows. But to deconstruct these a little bit, these participants characterize these particular indicators as indicators of well-being in their community for a number of reasons. Both indicators have a multi-generational component by including children in the indicator. The indicator on food speaks to resource abundance because it assumes that that particular community has enough resources to share with their neighbors. Also alluding to the value system of a community that prioritizes things like sharing. In the example about cows, that particular participant came from a pastoral community in Africa and explained that they know that their community is well when the tone of the community is such that they can hear the children singing to the cows, and that they do have an abundance of cows around, being that cows are extremely important in pastoral communities. We also heard examples like the presence of community conserved areas or community co-management of natural parks and reserves. Moreover, community level perceptions on the quality of Indigenous or local engagement and participation in those areas. These examples have strong alignment with what we see in the international decision-making scale. For instance, by multilateral groups such as the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, who has an indicator on the trends in the degree to which traditional knowledge and practices are respected through their full integration, safeguards, and the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local community members in national implementation. Through our efforts and through discussions with our collaborators, we've also heard a very strong call for action-oriented products, tools, and resources. Along those lines, we'll share highlights from some of our most recent products that are intended to advance action on this topic. At the request of our collaborators, the CBC curates an online content hub for sharing existing tools and materials on community-based and culturally relevant monitoring and assessment, with a specific focus on approaches that link biological and cultural indicators. Resources gathered to date include frameworks, guides, case studies, and practical tools that can be useful to communities, as well as many of the national institutions, researchers, and organizations that work with communities. One key example of our community-focused outputs is the Vina Cookbook. The title Vina speaks to food prepared to take on a journey. The cookbook was created collaboratively with local community members in West Parada, Solomon Islands, who were concerned that their environmental knowledge and practices surrounding food were not being taught to younger generations. This cookbook is a community-owned product that is distributed by the community members themselves, who also gave us permission to share the story of its development and selected highlights of its content. The cookbook is oriented around locally and culturally valued species that can be found in the local coastal environment. It weaves together multiple ways of knowing, including place-situated Indigenous and local knowledge and practices, together with prominent global approaches to diet and health. Together, this synthesis of evidence speaks to resource management practices that ensure abundant availability into the future and highlights family recipes, preparation methods, and nutritional information on culturally valued foods. Given the nature of our work, we've also produced a number of high-quality publications from the working group and together with our collaborators. In many of these papers, there are 30+ co-authors because we highly value the opportunity to partner and collaborate with community members, ministry representatives, multilateral donors, among others. We know that these papers make important contributions to the literature and to the field, but for us, one of the most telling measures of success that we've seen is when we present at global fora like the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Delegates request copies of the papers to feed directly into their negotiation and decision-making processes. The latest release from our group focuses on better understanding how local and global definitions of success feed into conservation and sustainability. This is important in part because as we've heard over the course of our work, there can be significant disconnects between the values and indicators of success used at the local scale and those that are derived from outside of the community, particularly when priorities and indicators are set at the global scale. These disconnects can lead to misallocation of resources, and sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, can actively undermine resilient community relationships and institutions. Together with our SNAP collaborators, we developed and released a set of outreach materials for national and multilateral reporting using locally and culturally attuned metrics. These resources are available online at the website that you see here. While the modules were primarily developed for national level reporting agencies and international and regional funding bodies in the Pacific, their components are likely to resonate across regions and groups. Ultimately, these documents are intended to enhance cross-scale indicator efforts by focusing on ways to adapt existing national or global indicators, and could also be useful for groups who are actively generating their own indicators. We'll quickly point out that in 2020, the CBC and partners from the Centre for Indigenous Conservation and Development Alternatives, or CICADA Canada, released a set of policy briefs on bioculture indicators, which provide some additional background and framing on the topic. These and other policy guidance docs from CICADA are available at the website that you see here. With that, we'd like to close by extending our sincere appreciation to the individuals, groups, and organizations who have made this work possible. And I'd like to conclude with our contact email should you have any questions, or if you'd like to learn more, please go to our website, amnh.org/CBC. Mahalo nui loa. Thank you all very much.
Well, that was a wonderful talk on a very interesting topic from Paola and her colleagues. We're just waiting for any questions to come in. If you do have any, please do post them now. In the meantime, I actually have a question myself. It's about the different indicators and tools and guidances that you've produced, which seem to be extremely useful. I was just wondering whether those were independently created separately for different Indigenous groups, or whether it was a kind of an attempt sort of as a catch-all for a number of different cultural relevances. So that question to Eleanor and Sam.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. That's a really terrific question, and it's actually both. And we tried very hard to ensure that that database has information that would be relevant across different scales. So we collated information that would have been internally validated within the knowledge system of a particular place, and shared those kinds of information that would be specific to a people of that place. And then we also in the database have vetted documents that came from people who worked across multiple systems. So for instance, there's the UN University has a set of indicators they've developed for use in those social ecological production systems across multiple spaces and places. And they basically have developed the indicator set and then tried to implement it in different places, and then explained what and how they did to modify for different settings. And so what we spent a huge amount of time doing is thinking through, how do you ensure that you have tailored information that's relevant for decision making in a place, but also have the ability to think about standardization or comparisons across places. And so different data sets or different metric systems do different things. Right. I mean, one of the things that's really important is that there are systems that are used, for instance, by the US government that we mentioned before for instance, food security. But when I worked overseas, I watched those being implemented, and people just flat out lied because the questions were so culturally inappropriate that people didn't want to answer them, or they translated. In one place, the nurse was asking how many times a week do you eat meat, which wasn't something that was appropriate for the setting, and so the translator said, how many children do you have? So technically the information is comparable, standardized across nations, but that is in part because the implementation is really thought through from a cultural standpoint. So we're trying to figure out bias and bias minimization and things like that, and ways that you can address it beyond just standardizing.
Wow, I mean, that's just really illustrative of some of the huge challenges that are faced as you're doing this cross-cultural work. And yeah, hats off to you and the whole team who are working on this. And I'm sure there's more to come. There's a lot more work to do, I'm sure. So absolutely. Thanks very much, Sam. It's coming now to the end of our allotted time, so I want to say a massive thank you for everybody for attending, and also to our speakers who've provided us with a wonderful session of very diverse and interesting talks. And now I'll just hand over to Jess to finish off.
Right, thank you. Thanks to our session chair, Jackie, for a great session, all of our presenters today. A reminder that if you asked a question that didn't get answered, our presenters will get these via email and can get in touch with you. If you have any other questions afterwards, you can just contact info@environmentalevidence.org, which will also be posted in the post-webinar email. This webinar was recorded and will be added to our YouTube channel by tomorrow if you missed anything and want to rewatch. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and invite you to join our next session on February 9th, which will be evidence co-production and use in environmental policy processes in Africa. Registration is now open on our website. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next month.